So the idea with the short research project is to consider the technological advancements that were introduced to a power plant known as Indian Point Energy Center. Through the presentation, information and recent debates will be exposed in order to create a more knowledgeable society whose opinions will now be more informed, because with public knowledge of technology such as this, it will help ease the state that which most of us belong in, a state of technological somnambulism. From the scaled-out view of the United States, an individual that lives their lives day by day sees the U.S. through essentially perfect eyes, a landmass that all seems to work through its various parts in order to produce a perfected whole. However, when we zoom in on these parts, for instance, the waterways and their relationships to the states that they run through, we start to notice a connection in terms of toxicity. In this case, the waterways are represented in dark green, while each state is represented with their toxicity levels by the different shades of gray. Each one of the waterways are entities of production. Water is essential for the technological innovations that we produce on a daily basis. And as we look at the map, we notice the shades of gray, which pinpoint the pounds of toxic waste connected to each state. The highlighted section being the Hudson River Valley, which is where Indian Point Power Plant exists, as this is working right now. This area produces about 7.5 to 15 million pounds of toxic discharge per year. Why is this? After becoming more familiar with the waterways' significance and their inclusion in specific states, total production costs become relevant, as water affords production either in the form of power, sanitation, or something else. Each one of the dots in this case imply a factory, power plant, or technological producer in that area. Each one of the shades of green is related to a total cost, and we see a high amount of production which is related to the power plants in that area. These power plants contribute to powering one of the largest cities in the world, New York City. Each one of these bigger dots are associated with multiple smaller dots, facilities which add to the contamination in the air that we are currently seeing and walking through on a daily basis. The 4 states that are charted out are the 4 largest producers to this contamination, and New York is included as number 1. While the green dots represent companies with no violations, the black are the companies that have violations, meaning that they have afforded air pollution or water contamination in a way that is hazardous if they continue. But what does this lead to? What facilities become the worst at contaminating these waterways and producing the immense amount of air contamination and pollution? A question is afforded below. Within the Hudson River Valley, which is what we are now zoomed in on, there are multiple facilities within towns that produce pollution. The towns are listed to the side. They are generally located along railroad lines and these waterways that I was talking about earlier. These 2 entities essentially help facilities with the upkeep of the products that they are producing. These entities also afford methods of transportation. In most cases, it is transportation of natural materials. If we look down at the bottom of the Hudson River Valley, where I am right now, that is where Indian Point Power Plant is located. After recognizing the Hudson River Valley as one of the leading producers of water contamination and air pollution, we can also conclude that a major source that is being produced from, in terms of water contamination, is Indian Point Energy Center. With its process that ends up producing an enormous amount of power, it affects the waterways greatly. The waterway is now highlighted with different shades of gray in order to understand the parts of the river that can be used to swim in, those that you can't fish in at all, and those that are not even allowed close to the water. Facilities such as Indian Point create this catastrophe and lead to contamination such as PCBs in a way that no one can use the river for food anymore. It can only be rendered as a method of transportation and power production now. But it is not only this that scares most of the residents in the area, but it is also Indian Point's potential disaster. If Indian Point were to undergo a terrorist attack, earthquake, or internal failure, the contamination that would flood out of the area would be outrageous. It is said that the cloud of contamination would be the thickest and most dangerous, and it would surround an area within 10 miles. Less significant areas would be included within a 50-mile radius. So with this, we ask ourselves another question. What makes Indian Point Energy Center stand out from the rest? Why does it have such a higher risk involved? The 6 power plants that are located along the Hudson River Valley do substantial harm to the waterways. I will quickly go through each one of the power plants and their methods for energy production in order to make a point that nuclear power is both very different and very dangerous. Something to keep in mind is that each of these power plants end up producing energy that is transmitted to the area's generating station. After, it is transmitted again to the New York energy grid, which then supplies the individuals. That process is diagram above. The first plant, which is extremely close to RPI, is Albany Station. It is one of the newly renovated plants whose system does not use as much of the Hudson River Valley water supply as all the rest of the power plants that we will see. It is a combustion and steam turbine operated plant that includes evaporative cooling towers, and the plant is owned by PSG. Danksgamer is an old power plant that uses a large amount of coal in order to run appropriately. Because of this, it puts out a large amount of pollution into the air on a daily basis. It is a natural gas, oil, and coal-fired steam electric generating facility that is owned by Denergy and has 4 steam units. The next system that we see is Rosetown. It is a typical power plant for the area, which uses natural gas and a boiler to convert the natural resources into steam. It produces a lot of pollution that gets displaced into the air. It is a natural gas and oil-fired steam electric generating facility that is owned by Denergy, like Danksgamer. We can see the process is completely different than the one we saw before. Bowline Point is the 4th power plant. Notice that we are getting closer to the proximity of New York City. This power plant is a different type that uses natural gas and oil. However, it uses many more cooling towers and therefore withdraws a lot more water from the Hudson River than any other power plant, actually. It is a natural gas and oil-fired steam electric generating facility that is owned by Merit Bowline LLC. So if we want a power plant, we get to Indian Point, which becomes the focus of this entire research process. Indian Point is the 5th power plant, and is the 2nd closest to New York City. The first closest is actually right across the river. Indian Point is the only massive nuclear power plant that is located along the Hudson River. It uses a massive amount of water to cool the nuclear fusion process of energy production. However, notice that the transmission grid is much larger than the rest. The transmission grid is at the top. And see the green lines, you can see that it runs from the top all the way down to New York City. Westchester is at the top. The nuclear power plant is owned by Energy, and Consolidated Energy is the actual distributor. So, how does this process work? By nuclear rods and a turbine that is powered by a diesel generator, the energy production functions. The water is present to cool the system after nuclear fusion takes place. Showing the network grid of this final power plant, you will see a much smaller distribution of energy, which consequently means a less chance of high disaster. However, Lovett is singly supplied by coal as a natural resource and emits extreme toxicity levels because of this. It is known to be one of the worst power plants that is located along the Hudson River. It is a coal-fired fossil fuel electric power station that is owned by Miriam. The reason I supplied the information to each one of these power plants is not to dwell on the engineering of each, but to quickly look at the difference and what parts of the system at Indian Point could be leading to such high potentials of disaster. What might society like, and what might society hate? Shifting the focus to a source that creates a foundation to the argument of the position of society when it comes to nuclear power plants is Diablo Canyon and the Whale in the Reactor by Langdon Winter. Upon an interested young boy's tour of the canyon, he was viewing out the window of the bus and visualized the whale that had blown water into the air and then quickly disappeared. The canyon is impeccable with its multiple green slopes that seem to touch the clouds. However, as they rounded the next corner, the young boy noticed the new implementation of a nuclear power plant. It was informed that the plant afforded many jobs and provided energy for the surrounding areas. However, the symbolism with the whale seemed to point towards the opposite effect. This nuclear reactor poses dangers of catastrophic failure that would happen. Dangers like 3 Mile Island, and what the whale was pointing towards might be instances such as this. The idea that Winner points out is that this site represented a tendency to accept radical transformations of its way of life, to accept sweeping changes generated from faraway sources with little discussion or thought to the consequences that he now saw as something truly astonishing. He said, we are technological somnambulists, wandering through an extended dream, much of it being pure innocence and ignorance. With this example, it shows the connection to Indian Point nuclear power plant in the way that these technologies might be producing electricity, and the greater harm that these things could be doing, and sometimes it takes an enormous creature like the whale to realize this. Like Winner says, the whale was swimming gracefully in a timeless ecosystem, but he was then put up against a gigantic piece of apparatus. The two were then facing each other through a complicated mechanism of the present-day technological society. So with the relationships between the two power plants, you could say that both groups of individuals that live in the area are mere spectators and consumers of change. This might be the prime time to include a personal thought that with including the opinion of the public and creating resources to inform them so they are competent about the subject might be another level in which the link between business and society needs to achieve. Right now, it is mainly business approaches producing a completely authoritarian management and leading to an example of political technology. With including the opinions and informing the public about both the hazards and the benefits that these nuclear power plants provide might shed some light on the fact that they are ultimately in danger. That is what this diagram shows. With nuclear power plants producing soil contamination, air pollution, and water pollution, it leads to an attack on the human body. For example, carbon monoxide, which is seen right here, can produce anything from headache, fatigue, to respiratory illness, to gastrointestinal disease. And on the other side, bacteria, parasites, and the chemicals that are found in water pollution can lead to the same things, mainly headache and fatigue and gastrointestinal disease. So, we have to start asking questions like, do you want to be faced with these possible risks to your health? Or do you want to see an end to these pollution factors such as Indian Point Energy Center? With all the factors seen on the last slide, these are the graphs that lead to these illnesses. The shade of green that is most important to society and something that they should become aware of is dark green. It presents the area listed. The lighter greens show the area's relationship to the New York level and then to the United States level for that particular type of toxicity. But, just to pinpoint a big problem, if we look at the area where Indian Point is located, which is near Cornwall, New York, with the New York overall levels being extremely high compared to the United States toxicity levels, we also conclude that this area is leading in water contamination and indoor air quality. This is highly due to the flushing of the water at Indian Point. The amount of water that is withdrawn from the system after cooling is enormous, and therefore creates a level of water contamination that individuals should not even go within 10 feet of. It all makes sense. It has the highest amount of water withdrawal at Indian Point, that is, of over 2,800,000,000 gallons of water per day. After being pushed through the system to cool the process of nuclear fusion, the water is put back into the Hudson, completely contaminated, and with this, it leads to over 1 billion fish and over 1 million impinged fish per year, a scale that is completely unacceptable.